I'm Sarusha Mann, and I'm the founder of SATI, the Sustainable Alpine Tourism Initiative. So a little bit of background for those of you that don't know. I set up SATI as a result of my research into sustainability leadership and circular economy at Cambridge University, because one of the things we had to do was apply a personal leadership challenge. And I noticed that a lot of the work that was done and the research in terms of on the academic side, and especially around circular business models, hadn't necessarily been applied to tourism. And so I wanted to explore that initially. And since 2018, the project's really grown to be a very multi-region, cross-sector, and also cross-stakeholder initiative. And I'm really delighted that today I think we've got people from all regions of the world joining. I think we've got some people from the Himalayas, which is fantastic. We've got lots of people from Europe, the UK, also the Americas as well. So really delighted that you could all be here today, and thank you so much for joining. So a bit of background behind this particular session and why we've put this on. So you'll see a link here in front of you on the screen to essentially join a LinkedIn group, because we really want to keep the conversation going. And one of the reasons why we put this particular event on today is because we noticed that over the last kind of year of conversations, there's been a lot of need for people to see practical solutions and really tangible roadmaps in terms of sustainability, and looking at how you can actually apply some of those principles that are really quite scientific sometimes, especially on looking at decarbonisation, looking at circularity, and then applying that to an on-the-ground perspective. And all of the people around the table here today and our panelists are completely at the forefront of that. So I'm really quite honoured that they could join today and be part of this journey with you all. So a bit of background also behind this particular topic of measuring and managing impact. So one thing that I've noticed over the last, not just few months, but I'd say a few years, and my background is in finance, sustainable finance in particular, is that we have a lot of siloed conversations, in the sense that people are looking at different frameworks on climate action. They're looking at how to advance a net zero strategy, for example, and yet there's not much connection between people on the ground that are actually doing this. So there's kind of a higher level dialogue going on, and then there's an on the ground perspective. And I think what's great is that when we bring the on the ground perspective up, we avoid some of this incrementalism that seems to be going on around the climate action narrative, especially within tourism. So I think with all of the speakers we've got today, they've kind of broken down the silos in lots of different ways. I think one, in the different industries, I think they don't see tourism as simply being the tourism board or one kind of specific type of stakeholder. I think they see the whole supply chain of tourism, including the community as well, which is really vital, I think, as we look forward to a just transition, and especially rebuilding tourism. I say in a post-COVID world, but we're still in a COVID-impacted world. And I think everybody around the table here is doing great things on that, and they're going to share that today. I think the second thing is that they've broken the silos in terms of collaboration and the types of stakeholders they're engaging with. So I think hopefully that'll be useful for quite a few of you to hear about as well. And finally, I think the regional silos as well. And I think I know Jeremy in particular is going to share some examples of potentially outside of the Alps as well, and other things that he's seeing which could be useful for you all to hear about today. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and thank you so much for our panelists for joining as well today. So we have, although Richard is running a little bit late, so I think he will move to Q&A slightly towards the end. So I have Jeremy Smith, who's the co-founder of Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency, and I think Jeremy's one of the most progressive people I've met in the space of tourism, and looking at how we can get quite tangible action in terms of climate blueprints. And so he's going to share a bit about that today. We've got Clare Truphet, who's an Alpine Manager of Fish and Pips, and Clare is based in Mirabel, and has a really quite on the ground perspective of what they're doing in the business and what SMEs can do to actually manage waste, manage their environmental footprint, and actually collaborate with other SMEs as well. And so she'll share a bit about that. We have Gavin Fernie-Jones, who's an amazing supporter of SATI over the last few years, and he's really probably the most activist, I would say, in his approach and his mindset, but also so grounded in terms of business model innovation and circularity and having a really progressive vision of what's required for not only SMEs, but also community action around circular transition and looking at moving from linear business model to circular business model. And he'll share a bit about what he's doing to engage SMEs in this space, and crucially, the education that's required to do that. We also, I believe he's just joined, Richard Leafe, who is the Chief Executive of the Lake District National Park. And Richard is going to talk about the net zero strategy of the park and also about what a destination can do to progress that. And then we have our two facilitators as well today. So the way the session works is we have a panel session, and then we move into breakout rooms where you can all connect and discuss further in terms of some of the levers that have been talked about on the panel. So essentially, the two facilitators that we're joined by is Jim MacNeil. Jim's a sustainability researcher based in North Italy, although today he's actually dialing in from France, I believe. And Jim is really at the forefront of looking at how communities can engage around climate action and some of the challenges towards that and how you can overcome that. And I know that Jim and Gavin have been collaborating quite closely in terms of as a result of the SATI dialogue, which is great. And we also have Dan Wilson, who's been absolutely instrumental in terms of bringing about SATI and has worked with me over the last few years. Dan is also was a ski instructor, has a really kind of in-depth knowledge about some of the stakeholders that we need to engage in mountain regions. He's based in Austria, and I think again there's quite a diverse perspective there, although he is an Australian, so I think he's got the Aussie perspective on top of that as well. So I'm going to start and with Jeremy actually. Oh, sorry, I realized that we hadn't gone through this. So for anyone that missed the previous sessions, there's actually a highlights report which you can access and download by just going onto this QR code. It's also on our website. But I do encourage you to look at that, because a lot of the series that we've created this year is actually based off of the highlights that we've got from the previous year. So we're just going to start with Jeremy and then move across to Richard and the rest of the team to go through their perspectives. So Jeremy, thank you so much for joining today, and absolute pleasure to welcome you to SATI and to be part of the project. So I know that in your work in terms of Tourism Declares, you obviously collaborate with lots of different regions, lots of different destinations, and lots of different types of stakeholders. So I think given your experience and your really quite forward-thinking approach to what tourism can do to manage its environmental footprint in particular, what do you see as a progressive destination level decarbonisation plan? And can you share some examples and factors that you think matters in ensuring that the transitions that are being created are actually material and as progressive as they need to be given the stage of the climate crisis that we're at?
I hope so. Thank you very much, Risha, for inviting me here and giving me the chance to talk a bit about what I've learned in the last couple of years and what I continue to learn by the day and by the week with the work we do through Tourism Declares. I should make it clear, I'm not a mountain specialist. I do love skiing, but I don't have a specific deep understanding of how the issues are unique in mountains compared to other places. But because you did say that very much we're looking to go beyond silos, hopefully my broader connection with other places and other issues and other sectors has some relevance. As I said, this has been the biggest process of learning for me, individually and collaboratively, probably in my life. It's that strange thing that the last sort of year and a half of isolation has fermented huge amounts of opportunity to collaborate. A little background, I think maybe on Tourism Declares, because I have to assume that the majority of people don't really know what we are, rather than assuming that everyone does. We launched Tourism Declares, those of us, the co-founders, in January 2020. And it had come off the back of several months of conversations, which were the conversations that I've had for years around the frustrations that there was a lack of a coherent response in our industry to the climate emergency, that it was fragmented, often conflicting, confused. It didn't seem to be based in science. It was based in comms, to be honest, more than science. And I say that as a comms person. And this didn't make sense to me. As someone who had come from sustainability into tourism, which is often the reverse journey that people make. I used to edit an environmental magazine in London, and then I came from that into tourism back in 2007. I had always had my eye and an awareness on what's happening outside our industry. And back in 2016, a suburb north of Melbourne called Darebin declared a climate emergency, and that was the first time anywhere in the world that sort of meme, that concept had been expressed, and it was the community came together and said, we need to put aside incrementalism, we need to recognize that this is an emergency and respond accordingly. And what does that look like? And they created their first plan, their climate action plan, and so on. That initial initiative now has sort of reoccurred, adapted, modified, whatever you might say, across, I haven't checked that recently, but I'd say over 2,000 now places around the world that range from a village to a district borough council, to a county council, to a state, to countries, to country governments, to the European Parliament. And we've seen London Council, London, Scotland, Paris, Barcelona, European Parliament. So it starts in place, and I think that was a very important thing, because before COVID, the tourism conversation around sustainability was very much around the need to respond to over-tourism and to reconnect tourism to the places where we exist. Second to that, what then happened was that sectoral climate emergency declarations began to happen, and what we saw is you can see architects declare, engineers declare, business declares, doctors declare, universities declare. And this seemed to us a unique opportunity for tourism, with our sort of combination of the private sector and the places where we operate, to bring it together. So that was the framework we took. We launched Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency January 2020 with 14 founder signatories, all making a shared set of commitments. And the heart of those commitments were to treat it as an emergency, to publish a climate action plan for what you as an organisation were going to do to respond, and to ensure that that action plan was grounded in the demands of science, which was, at the time, we've said that we needed to focus on the shorter term rather than the longer term. Tourism likes to say carbon neutral 2050. We said that if you're going to get to carbon neutral 2050, priority needed to be the cut emissions in half by 2030, or even focus on annual reductions. That has become more and more common parlance since we talked about that in 2020. We're now at 280 companies, organizations, destinations who have joined and have, over the course of the COVID crisis, have said, well, we also have to look beyond and to start planning for what comes next. And that has initiated ever-growing, ever-mushrooming sets of conversations and collaborations, as we all start with a blank sheet of paper, because there isn't you can't download the sort of PDF template of a climate action plan and then just fill in the gaps. We start with our own set of questions, and what we've learned is that we are sort of learning the questions together, and we do that through our group of volunteers, through the community that everyone joins into Tourism Declares once they've signed up, through working groups. That we have a destination working group, a tour operators working group, an accommodation working group. We have lots of sort of leading actors and stakeholders in those sectors coming together to share their own initiatives and to understand what's happening. And then in Jan this year, we announced that we would publish 3 climate action blueprints by COP26 in November this year, which was both we felt that everyone was staring at a blank sheet of paper. What could we do to support people in publishing their climate action plans? What could we learn from these conversations, from these early experiments, to support one another? And what we see is how complicated it is, because the very nature of our industry is its diversity, is its unique place-based approach, and a one-size-fits-all top 10 tips to create your climate action plan is by default going to fail. But at the same time, if we don't have some level of comparability, of commonality, of scalability, then we end up being unable to benchmark against one another and unable to see who's doing well and what we should prioritize and what we should learn. And that is sort of what we continue to do endlessly at the moment. And those blueprints aim to support everyone in publishing a climate action plan, looking at how they should measure, how they should reduce, how they should adapt, regenerate, finance, engage. It's hard enough for tour operators and for accommodation, because what are you going to focus on? The science-based targets? Are you going to focus on net zero and long-term goals? Is it carbon neutrality? But it gets incredibly complicated when we start talking at a place, at a destination level. I mean, does Maribel measure its carbon emissions, or is it Courchevel or Val Thorens, or is it Le Trois Vallées, or is it the whole Haute-Savoie, or is it the Alps? And probably the Alps are shared across France and Switzerland and Austria. And then is it France's responsibility, and whose responsibility, and how do we actually get to a point of measuring? And it changes depending upon whether you're at a national level or at a societal level. And I know I'm not answering the question with anything other than questions, but this is very much where it is, the need to have those questions. And then the question, especially at a destination level, expands to how do you not just measure decarbonize and focusing on emissions, but expand that into biodiversity, societal impacts, relationship to individual and community health, and the economic impacts, many of which are obviously as important, intersect completely with the climate issues, and potentially are things that a destination can have a greater impact on than emissions from the private sector. And finally, how do you balance the need to measure without fixating on it rather than just getting on and acting? And it continues to get more complicated because for every destination, it depends on their relationship with government, their relationship with the private sector, their relationship with their citizens as to where their responsibility and influence lies. That said, there are good examples. And I would say at a country level, Norway's recent sustainability tourism roadmap or sort of framework that it's published is absolutely stands out. It's quite phenomenal. And the scale of commitment that they're looking around reducing emissions from the tourism by 50% at a country level, and acknowledging that to do that with about 75% of the emissions coming from transport, that they need to shift the way that they market tourism to Norway. But how can they do that in such a way that doesn't then suffer the biodiversity doesn't suffer, the community impact doesn't suffer, and how do you do it in a fair way? They are measuring the relative impacts of tourists from different source markets to compare how far they come, what impact that has, what they spend when they're here, how long they come to stay, what they do, to try and understand and begin to work out where they should be prioritizing. But then there's another level you could see that when we Visit Scotland, who joined us in November and became the first national tourism organisation to declare, they've set hugely ambitious targets entirely defined by what their government's targets were, which are sort of world-leading targets on net zero. And their whole approach is around engaging their whole tourism sector and bringing in all manner of different actors across the industry. And in the last few months, we've seen more per head companies and organisations joining Tourism Declares from Scotland than anywhere else. And I could, there are others. I mean, again, in Scotland at a regional level, what the Cairngorms is looking at doing is an incredibly impressive, holistic, really interconnected sort of approach to climate action plan that truly looks at how you can not only engage in climate, but use that same approach to engage in education, and then work to sort of ensure that they're developing programs to support access to nature, to support people with dementia, connect. And it's not just about a sort of dramatic response, it's about developing a thriving sort of community more enhanced with in hand with nature. And there are others, what Helsinki is doing, what Jackson's Hole is doing, and I don't want to take up the entire conversation because I suspect I've been rabbiting for ages. But for me, the challenge is how we can build on these examples and come together to find the response that suits the different destination, the different company, and it just becomes an ever more complicated conversation, but one we have to have.
There's so many things in what you've said that resonate in terms of both some of the research that I've done, but also the dialogues that we've had in SATI to date over the last year or so. I think the point on place-based approaches is so critical. I think in discussing with especially local stakeholders that are very new to the idea of decarbonisation pathways and things which might seem quite polarised from their BAU business models, there is a real resistance of kind of big picture ideas that stem from potentially even outside of the region, outside of the country, and that waterfall effect of the federal level, the regional level, and even more local than the regional level, I think is so critical in the types of pathways that are being explored, partly to overcome some of that resistance that might be faced on a community. I think the economy-wide transition is really interesting that you mentioned in terms of the impact of some of the organizations that tourism declares then having an effect on the businesses that are operating in that region and in that area. I think there can be a real galvanizing impact in terms of sustainability leader taking direction and declaring the emergency, and then subsequently the actors around that then make up tourism in the economy and are part of the supply chain of tourism then become quite engaged on the issue. And I think finally the point that you mentioned on the embedded transport's very interesting. So I know that a lot of people on the call today, including Richard from the Leafe District and several others from the Alps that are looking at decarbonising from the transport part of the supply chain, are really looking quite a lot at the transport issue. I think what I find fascinating when you look at, and this is quite technical on the emissions side, is that the majority of emissions in tourism are obviously scope 3, which is kind of outside of the control of the hotel themselves or the kind of destination provider even, because it's embedded within how somebody gets to a resort, for example. So somebody's scope 3 is actually another person's scope 1 and 2. Therefore, I think the type of collaboration that's required in tourism is a whole supply chain emissions collaboration, really, whereby, and I think it would be interesting, I haven't explored Norway's plan as much, and it'd be quite interesting to delve into that to see, okay, how do they then address the embedded emissions of scope 1 and 2, which are slightly out of their control, but which they can influence and which can then be incentivized through hotels who are, for example, looking at price incentives to reduce the cost by 5% or whatever for a tourist that arrives by train. And I've seen some examples of hotels trying to do that through a kind of green price incentive. But I think it relies again on that interconnectivity between the stakeholders. And I think thank you so much for sharing those examples, because I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure everybody on the line will definitely be in touch, and please do connect with Jeremy as well. And I've put his LinkedIn there, and I'd encourage you all to connect with him. So this brings us really nicely onto Richard, who is the Chief Executive of the Lake District National Park. And I think in terms of the dialogue Richard and I have had over the last few months, I think what's really interesting is that some of those levers that you mentioned, Jeremy, in terms of having a quite holistic strategy, both on the carbon side in terms of decarbonisation and nature based tourism as well, is something that Richard and his team are looking quite progressively at. So I don't know, Richard, if you can hear us. Hopefully you can hear us okay. And I think hopefully we can see you as well. Let's see. Yes, we can. Excellent. So thank you so much for joining us all today, Richard, and great to have you on the panel. And I think what's really interesting for our audience to hear in particular is, how do you actually see net zero as an opportunity in terms of mountain regions? I know that historically quite a few of the stakeholders that we had on the calls were actually based in the Alps, but I think that what you're doing in the Lake District actually is incredibly progressive in terms of the type of impact matrix you're looking at, and actually the fact that you've set a carbon budget and calculated what that looks like. So it'd be great for people to hear a little bit more about that. And also what I'll do afterwards is I'll share on the SATI channels a bit of information as well about that carbon budget, because I think we would love to hear more about that from your perspective and how you see that.
Thank you, Sarisha. Sorry to arrive a little bit late, and hello everybody from the rainy Lake District. Of course, I often say it never rains here, but it does sometimes.
Is it raining today?
We wouldn't have any lakes. It's raining today. Our climate, of course, is, as we all know, living and working in mountain regions as we are, is a rapidly changing thing already. With the climate change we experience now, regardless of what's to come. And so addressing that, adapting the landscape, making ourselves more resilient to the climate experiences that we're having is super important. And I think precisely because we are, if you like, the canary in the cage for the changing climate, I think it's really important to show our visitors and our resident communities that we are being responsible and leading the way in dealing with some of that carbon. So And I also think from a marketing point of view, it's increasingly important for our visitors to understand that by visiting a mountain region or a national park, you are contributing, you are making a contribution to the solution and not to the problem. So getting the destinations on a net zero track and visibly demonstrating that, including the routes that people travel into the protected area, I think is a pretty critical thing to do. So understanding our territorial carbon metrics, perfect timing.
Hopefully this has come up on time. I was hoping that the chat would show. Here we go. Can everyone see that on the screen? It's a little bit, I'm trying to zoom into it there.
I'll let you zoom into it. Don't worry, I'll talk over
Okay.
it while you see if you can make the slide a little larger. Yeah,
there we go.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. So understanding the carbon that we're responsible for in this case in the Lake District National Park is something that we think is absolutely fundamental and crucial to the future, and it's going to be a big part of the rest of our professional livelihoods is understanding the carbon that we are responsible for and taking action that's within our control or our influence to work on it. This is something that the Lake District has been doing for the last 10 years. So we've had a carbon budget for the territory of the national park, 900 square miles of uplands in the northwest of England. And we've known fairly precisely how much carbon we're responsible for, and we've put in place plans to reduce it. The good news is, over 10 years, we have succeeded in reducing our budget. The bad news is we've reduced nowhere near enough. So we've been trying to achieve reductions of 1% of our budget of about 3.2 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year, 1% through local actions. And over that 10-year period, we've achieved half of the 10% we should have done. So just under 5% reductions in the overall budget. Now, of course, with net zero coming along, we need to rapidly increase the rate at which we make those reductions in order to get to net zero by 2050 at the latest in the case of the United Kingdom. That's the law that targets where we're trying to hit. So that means moving from the 1% a year that we've been failing to hit for 10 years to about 13% a year from now on. And we've calculated on this graph that you see on the left-hand side that the earliest possible date we could reach net zero in the Lake District is 2037. And that's with negative emissions from land management, mainly tree planting and peat soil restoration, contributing to offset some of the carbon that is still in the budget for the national park over that time. We've just done an exercise for the next iteration of our management plan, which is shown in the slide here, to say if we want to get to net zero by 2037 in the Lake District, how much do we need to do in the next 5 years from now until 2025? And that is the square in the top left of the top left part of the graph, which is blown up into the bar on the top right of the graph there. And you can see that the initial curve is quite steep. So by 2025, we've got to save something like 800,000 tonnes of carbon a year. And the block on the right demonstrates that of the actions that we've got in place in our plan to deal with that, mainly around sustainable transport, moving people to the destination in a zero carbon way, or moving them around the national park when they are here in a zero carbon way. That added to land management, changes in land management through farming and forestry, nature recovery and climate action on land, and a bit of stuff in our communities, only gets us 20% of the way towards our target. So we've got a jaw-dropping 80% of those emissions by 2025 that we have no actions in place to deliver. So that shows the size of our challenge. And interestingly, that 80% of action that we haven't got in place corresponds very well to what the UK Committee on Climate Change said yesterday was the gap in terms of the UK government's policy approach to net zero, which lacks 80% of actions in order to get on track with the reductions that the UK as a whole is committed to. Interesting that that translates perfectly to our local budget here. So we've got a lot to do to fill that, and I'm happy to talk more about what those actions are, but I'm conscious that we've just got 6 minutes here. So I'll end it by summarising that I think for each and every mountain territory or national park, we need to own and understand our own carbon metrics, because without it, there's simply no way that we will know as a territory whether or not we're on track to achieve net zero. So thanks very much. I know that's a big and complicated subject, and I've just kind of teased you a little bit with that, and just shown you a little snapshot of the work that we've been doing here. Thanks.
I think it's fantastic, and I think what's amazing in what you've done is that you've tackled the issue very head-on in a scientific way. I think the biggest frustration I've had over the last few years with many dialogues I've had in mountain regions, and I think Jeremy alluded to this a little earlier, was that it was grounded in a non-scientific narrative. I think it started from the perspective of communication, and it kind of was anchored in something that wasn't necessarily scientific enough to actually tackle some of the issues around the climate crisis. And I think what both yourself and Jeremy are doing fantastically is setting quite progressive approaches for the fact that we actually need to calculate some of the issues around where does the carbon currently lie, what are the different levers to address that. I think what's interesting in the chart that you've shown on the right, and I love charts, I'm an economist, so I think when you said put the slide up, I was definitely keen to get a chart on the screen. And I think what's interesting is that when people look at tourism destinations, and in particular mountain regions, is that the built environment is kind of considered as exogenous to part of the tourism region operating. And I think one thing that's really interesting, especially when I speak to hoteliers, is that when you go to most mountain regions, the majority, which is not necessarily the case everywhere, but you do have lots of hotels, you have lots of infrastructure, which is technically it's not government owned, it's private assets. It's very much anchored in terms of people needing to take responsibility as an SME or as a hotelier or as a business which operates in that region. And I think that in order to really accelerate the transition, and we look at this in the finance side, I think it relies on that whole supply chain of community-based actors collaborating with some of those corporates as well. I think if you look at, for example, the idea of, and Jeremy mentioned this, the architects declare climate emergency. When a hotel, and this is not just specific to the UK, but outside of the UK, is retrofitting or rebuilding or extending or developing a new hotel themselves, they could actually consider the carbon footprint of the hotel as part of the decision-making process. And one thing I found very interesting in my research was that some people are very willing to do that, but others are very misinformed, but also not aware of the fact that that should be a critical part of how they actually address their carbon footprint as a business, and not just simply reduce plastic straws or do kind of incremental actions. And I think what's great about what you've presented there, Richard, is that I'd say it's the complete opposite of incrementalism, in the sense that you're really tackling the issue quite head on, and you're not afraid to address some of the really critical challenges. I think a lot of the narrative around climate action at an SME level is quite polarized, I've found, because I think there's it's like, well, it's not really a misunderstanding, but that these things are really expensive to implement as an SME, and also as a region, that, you know, we're not responsible for all of the carbon. This is always a rebuke that I got from lots of different people, was, oh, we're, you know, as a country, we're only responsible for X% of emissions globally. But actually, when you look at the emissions of the companies that operate in that country, the tourism sector in that country, the actors that make up the tourism sector, so many people can play a role in terms of accelerating climate action. And I think the fact that you've sort of presented this plan and really broke down into the sectors and subsectors, and Jeremy mentioned this earlier, I think it requires then all of those stakeholders to galvanize. But I think getting that common acceptance of the climate crisis, I think, was one of the biggest challenges that I found in the narratives that I've had so far. Partly because it is so grounded in fear, and it is so grounded in a kind of loss-based narrative. And that's why I think what you've presented there on the opportunity side of net zero is really, really interesting to reframe the discussion. I think finance was very much on the same maturity curve over the last few years, where 10 years ago it was kind of a climate risk, what is the loss, where are we going to lose out? And now it's kind of flipped completely, where you've got energy companies, even oil majors, that are doing sustainable finance frameworks because they realize the opportunity of the transition to do a completely different type of business model. And I think we need to really flip the narrative to be much more on the opportunity side of the transition. So thank you so much for presenting that today, and to both of you actually for that symbiotic discussion around what's necessary. So I'm just going to go back to sharing the other slides for a moment. Bear with me a second. And we're going to move to our next speaker. So I mentioned about galvanizing SMEs, and I think Gavin is a fantastic example of how that's being done. So Gavin is based in Courchevel in France, originally from Sheffield, so northern land, but he's really one of the most advanced thinkers in terms of circular business models. And I think circularity, for those of you that are quite new to the concept, is a way to move from kind of make and waste model in terms of resource use in particular, to one where you have a much longer life cycle of products. You look at how you can reuse a lot of the material. And actually in Gavin's case, he's looking at completely rethinking actually what an SME can do, where they're looking at subscription models, leasing, access to gear, and his approach in the outdoor industry is the most progressive I've ever seen, actually. And I would happily say that from discussions I've had with executives across the industry, and I think Gavin's definitely at the forefront of that. But for today, I would really like to share, and Gav, please do, I don't know if we can, hopefully we can hear and see you. We could see you a second ago. Amazing. So in terms of the work that you're doing at the moment, how do you think we could get more SME engagement on transition, in particular on circular economy strategies? I know that in the work that you're currently doing in terms of SME training and SME engagement, and Jeremy mentioned this earlier actually, around the shared learning, I think is really critical. So could you share a bit about what you're doing in this space at the moment, and why you think that's really important to move forward in terms of accelerating the transition?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me here, Sarisha. It's good to be back. Really exciting actually to see that graph, Richard. I come from a tourist area that definitely doesn't have a climate plan in place at all, so that's really exciting to see that some tourist boards are taking real charge on this and making some good ground. And I'd also like to, on this note, sort of echo what Jeremy said, is that we have such a wide variety of businesses in the mountain or national parks, that there really isn't a one model fits all kind of solution. And that's what we found over the last few years. So I actually own a small business in the Alps. It's a ski boot fitters called the Boot Lab. And a couple of years ago, we started addressing our environmental impact. We did that first off by looking at ways we could change our energy supply. But then we got more into looking into circular economics and how we could change our supply lines, how we could encourage our customers to reuse their products, to prolong their lifetimes. And then off the back of that, we kind of got asked by lots of SMEs in our region how they could take the same approach really, and how they could get involved. And we've learned a lot over the last couple of years. It's been a good experience, and we started off first by creating a kind of pledge system, which lots of people on here have heard of pledge systems. There's plenty of them, and essentially our pledge system was encouraging circular models. So we encouraged businesses like Fish and Pips, who you're going to speak to next, to sign up to certain pledges and to try and make practical solutions within their business. So we've been doing that for the last couple of years. It's been really successful. We've been very good at removing single-use plastic, for example, from our supply lines. Energy transition, it's been quite key and quite easy as well. But we've kind of got to a stage where we do this by getting companies to sign up and then working closely with these small businesses to try and change the supply line. So we go in, we do some education, we work with the staff, we get the team involved. But we found that due to our sort of size and scale, we're a voluntary organisation, everyone just gives up their time for free, that it's been very difficult to take that to a bigger audience, really. And so right now we're in the process of creating an online training platform, a course in a video format that is aimed at a wide variety of businesses operating in the Alps. So it's aimed at chalet companies, ski schools, ski shops like my own, transfer companies, and it's a way of helping those businesses make actual practical change. So the course we're building currently is going to be delivered in a video format, and as Jeremy said earlier, the sort of real key and goal to this course is to get these SMEs working collaboratively so that we start sharing solutions that work. Like a good, quite easy example of this is when it comes to, say, a transfer company, like a vehicle transfer company operating in the Alps. There is one company working in my region that has switched to completely electric vehicles. There are several other companies that want to, but just don't understand how they go about doing it. The steps to that, both practically but financially as well. So we're going to deliver a section on the course that explains how you run an electric vehicle in an Alpine region, how it works with refueling and things like that, but also more importantly, how you can make that work financially. So how many miles you do over a winter, say you do 60,000 kilometers, at what stage it becomes financially better for you to be running an electric vehicle when you take into account all the taxes involved in diesel and eco taxes that we now have. So it's that sort of solutions that we're trying to encourage. So we're trying to encourage a collective group in our area that will of small businesses that will then be able to bring about change. The sort of key for me is encouraging these businesses to work together so that we not only share our solutions, but we also have a bigger voice in this debate. So again, another example is if we were to run more and more electric vehicles, currently Geneva Airport doesn't have enough charging points for us to run more electric vehicles. So if we can collectively get together and say there's this many people, this many transfer companies that want to move to electric transport, and then engage Geneva and say, can you please help us in this process by fitting in more electric points? This is what we're going to need. And so sort of really, our approach is just a practical approach. You know, I run a small business. When I look at the size of the climate change issue, it's humongous, and I kind of feel like my small business has what difference is it really going to make to this problem? And so we've sort of looked at it from a practical point of view, taken the real steps that we can physically make, but also then try and engage other businesses around us to join in on the journey with us so that we have a bigger collective voice.
I think that's brilliant in terms of how you're bringing that shared knowledge and shared learning. I think one thing that really stood out more so from the kind of research side when we were initially setting up SATI was this huge knowledge gap. And I say gap, but it's more knowledge opportunity in terms of engaging on quite these practical steps about how a business is doing that, and the fact that you've got examples of a business that does and then shares that with people that want to do the same. I think historically tourism operated in really a competitive landscape whereby sharing that knowledge in the past may have been seen as kind of sharing and divulging the secrets of how you could actually get ahead of the competition in terms of some of those business model shifts that then lead to economic benefits, which obviously are grounded in the environmental benefit. And I think we're moving to a really interesting phase, not just in tourism, but I think across multiple sectors, where collaboration is much stronger and proven to be stronger in terms of that shared learning process and what's required. And I think we've got a comment actually in the chat from Danielle, who's also based in France, and I think she's obviously seeing a need for that kind of course as well. And I think it's really interesting that we've, of all of the companies that I have spoken to over the last few years through SATI, more so SMEs, I'd say, rather than large corporates, there's a real thirst for knowledge, but there's also an action gap in the sense that most of the types of knowledge spaces where they need to operate are really expensive, or they don't have someone that's specifically in charge of sustainability. They can't afford a kind of big four audit type company to come in and give them a business plan on how they can engage. And I think what you're doing in terms of democratizing that knowledge is really critical. And I think that as a lever to democratize knowledge is necessary across multiple sectors, not just tourism. I think finance totally is an ivory tower in that sense of not democratizing that knowledge. And I say that very openly because I've written about this quite extensively, the fact that we need to share that knowledge across the different sectors. We need scientists, we need businesses, we need policymakers, we need academics, we need students. We can't afford, given the scale of the climate crisis, to sit in silos. And I think it's great that you're bringing people together on the course to do that.
Well, I probably didn't say on that, just to quickly say that as well, is that as a small business owner, we just don't have the time, the resources and the finances, as you said, to engage on this subject, really. It's super difficult. And what we've tried to do is kind of make a collective, so everyone is kind of paying into going to provide the solutions and the resources that they need.
And it's like a shared process to do that, which is really, really interesting. So taking it over to another practical example, which is perfect timing actually, is to Claire, who's an Alpine Manager at Fish and Pips. So Claire, thank you so much for joining us today. And I know that you work very closely with Gavin in terms of your sustainability transition and also sharing that knowledge as one of those SMEs that's quite ahead and at the forefront of your approach on sustainability. So in terms of sharing with our audience today, it would be great if you could share a couple of examples of what you've done practically in the business to measure and manage impact, but also what you think the role of staff is within businesses to actually engage on some of the solutions that are required. I know that in my own research around circular economy of hotels, it seemed like quite a critical lever to get staff on board in terms of not only the ideation of some of these transition strategies, but also the implementation, so they feel like they're part of that journey. And I think that's really important in some tourism regions where there's quite a lot of transient employment. And I think there's a big question around the economic resiliency of employment for young people in particular. So yeah, it would be great to hear from you, Claire, about your perspectives on some of those things.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you again. Thank you so much for having me on here. It's a real privilege to be part of this great event. It's been so interesting listening to the previous speakers, and I've certainly got a few notes that I've taken to go away and look some things up and have some conversations. It's really reassuring actually to hear that things are going on at a higher level, because sometimes when, you know, from a small business point of view, we can feel very, very small, and like our impact is going to have absolutely no effect whatsoever. And you know, we definitely want to engage more with our local national park and our local authorities where we are here in France. So to give a bit of background, we're an accommodation provider based in the Three Valleys in Maribel, and we've always been really conscious of our impact on our local environment, and sort of started working with Gavin a few years ago to try and sort of start to try and make some changes. And you know, the most significant place we started from was we actually weren't very sure how to go about, you know, we didn't know where to start basically. So Gavin very kindly put together the pledge system for us, which we signed, and we went through it and we said, right, well, we think we can do this, we're not sure, we think we can do X, Y and Z. So in terms of where we are now, obviously COVID has slightly interrupted that. We've had a season of a paused season. We've had no winter this year, which has given us a bit of an opportunity to further take stock and set some good targets for the future, which has been really positive. But we needed to establish a baseline. We needed to know where we're at. So we know we need to reduce our carbon impact. We know we need to reduce our waste output. We know we need to increase our client engagement. So we needed to establish a baseline. And given from a very practical point of view, we have pretty much no budget for it. We also needed to do it ourselves. Obviously, we didn't have any kind of auditing experts coming in, so it's very much practical solutions that we were trying to focus on. And we figured that the data that we were setting out to collect would be very useful for us, obviously, to establish where we are and our starting point, but also useful for other businesses, local authorities. If we want to implement a food waste management system in our local authority, which we currently don't have, we wanted to be able to go to them with some data to say, this is how much food waste your average chalet, for example, would produce in a week, so they would know that the size of the facility that might need it, that might be required. We're coming at it from a different point of view, I suppose. So yeah, we were coming at it from a very low tech point of view. So looking at meter readings from the chalets. All the chalets are equipped with meter readings. So that was quite an easy one. And then we were trying to work out how to measure our waste output. So I bought a load of luggage scales. And I asked my teams to literally measure the bin bags, to weigh the bin bags at the end of every shift. And I asked them also to separate out all of their food waste so that we could determine what portion of food waste, what portion of the waste was coming from food. From a staff point of view, it was a bit of a challenge sometimes getting them on board, but we actually made this decision quite a long way before, and because of the transient nature, we do have quite a lot of new staff every year. So I actually made a very deliberate move and tried to put together a team that had the environment in mind. So the staff, I realised, are very, very key, as Sarisha's already mentioned, to making sure that they have to be on board. And if they're not on board, then you're basically a one-man band just sort of chipping away at this giant problem. And if the staff aren't on board, then you're not going to get anywhere. You're not controlling what they're putting in the bin. You're not controlling the conversations that they have with your clients. So having them on board and engaged is really important. And it starts with the recruitment. So making sure that our mission was sort of clearly advertised in all of our job adverts. Making sure that, a big tick in the recruitment process was them having read that and then mentioning it in their interview when they interview with us. We also had some really great training. Gav came along and we ran a brilliant training day. And whilst we had a clear idea of what we wanted to achieve with the staff over the course of the season, which was largely this sort of data capture mission, we wanted them to really feel part of it. And I think a collaborative approach was the best way. And we asked for their input, and actually they came up with some brilliant ideas, and then they really felt part of it. I definitely had to manage my expectations. I would love to have had every single member of the team on board. Unfortunately, we didn't have everybody, but we did have a good sort of 60% of the team who were really engaged, and some were more engaged than others. We wanted them to be passionate about it. We wanted them to care, because ultimately it's their future, it's their industry. They're having an amazing time doing a ski season in the Alps. We want it to be there for the future, I suppose. And actually, they were the biggest tool in engaging our clients. They were the biggest tool in capturing our data. And I have no doubt that they will be the biggest tool in us trying to move forwards. They will then hopefully go on to future employers and make those demands on their employers, asking the questions, asking what their new employers are going to be doing, coming, very much kind of from a grassroots sort of approach. So that was sort of the role of the staff, really. And yeah, it was and continues to be absolutely key. From a marketing point of view, you know, we can shout about what we're doing with our clients, but actually the best messaging actually comes from the fact that our teams are wearing the One Tree at a Time logo, which is Gavin's organisation. They're wearing it on their t-shirts in the chalets. Guests are asking what the logos are all about. They can hear the beep of the luggage scales. So that conversation is started with the clients, and then hopefully it'll get them thinking about how they travel to resort and the kinds of holidays they go on and what they look for in accommodation providers, because so much of this I think has to come from the traveller as well as the providers and the industry. So I think it's a two-way street.
And I love the proactivity of your approach. I think one thing that was quite interesting when I spoke to quite a few hoteliers, admittedly only in Austria at the time of the research study I was doing, was that there was a kind of questioning whether tourists cared. And I think there was a sort of resistance to put their neck on the line to actively engage with the tourist on this, because there was a worry that it would then change the brand value of what they were providing, but also that they weren't necessarily informed and able and confident to have those conversations. And I think what's great in your approach is that you've kind of done it as integrated throughout the business, and then engaging the guests in a way which makes them feel like part of that experience and makes them feel informed, and that's then a USP of the type of business you're running. And I think it's really interesting that you did that from the inside out versus the other way around, which is often the case in many of these transition business models, where it's actually done as an exogenous variable and not necessarily one where the staff are the ones that are changing the culture of the organization. And I think lots of other hoteliers can learn a lot from that approach that you've taken in terms of starting from the inside and changing the culture of what the business values that you have are really. And I think embedding those in something that is much more anchored in sustainability, and from a procurement perspective anchored in sustainability too. And I think that's what's really interesting. You haven't necessarily gone down just one element of a comms front. You've kind of started from quite an operational level and then progressed that. And I think that's interesting to see how you work with Gavin on that, because I think, again, that operational circularity is something that I think a lot of the stakeholders in your region are really strong at, and something that I think lots of people could learn from. And I think then the secondary impact of communicating that and sharing that knowledge is the way to scale it up. And then planting that seed with the customer is essentially kind of part of the end of the value chain. Some people say it starts with that, and I think there's a bit of a debate going on amongst some people that I'm speaking to about the push and pull factors. And it'd be interesting to continue some of that conversation in the breakout rooms as well, in terms of how you actually galvanize the community. So this brings me really nicely onto the breakout room. I'm conscious that we've overrun slightly on the panel, but I think we'll cut the breakout room time slightly, so you'll get around kind of 25 minutes in the breakout rooms to discuss. So I've seen that there's a couple of questions in the chat first that we'd like to address. We did have a concluding question for our panel, but I'm conscious of the time, so I think we'd prefer to spend a little bit more time in the breakout rooms if that's okay for our panelists. I just want to address this question, and do feel free to send some questions in the chat here. There's an interesting question coming on the chat around whether the metric of carbon is actually the best or currently the only way to measure the progress of sustainability of a place. And do we feel like there's other things that are potentially missing from that variable, or focusing too much on that variable? And I guess I might start with Jeremy and then Richard, and move to any of the other panelists to address this.
It's definitely not the only variable, and I mean, it's certainly not the only part of sustainability, but it is an enormously significant emergency that we shouldn't, I don't think we can, it's very hard to compare them. So it's very hard to say, well, we did a great job on engaging on inclusivity or engaging on various other issues, so that somehow allows us not to have engaged on climate. We sort of got to engage on them all and treat them all together.
Interesting. I guess, Richard, you might have a perspective on this, given the nature-based solutions you're looking at as well, which are slightly more on the biodiversity side. Although I see a very strong interconnectivity between the carbon narrative and the nature-based solutions narrative, which I think you're exploring quite strongly in the links.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those negative emissions need to come from actions in relation to land management that also have a benefit for biodiversity. So tracking your biodiversity stats in a national park is every bit as important. But I think there is a nice overarching thing with the carbon stats that is useful, because it does capture a lot of other processes, including waste management and things of that sort, which are often you know, both important and have a lot of embedded carbon in them. So using metrics across every area of the economy of the national park, carbon is a really interesting way for driving sustainability into all elements of those things, I think. So I wouldn't underestimate it. And your example of the hotel that you threw out earlier, we have one of the best Lake District hoteliers on the call, actually, Dan Visser. We use his hotel privately owned and run through a cooperative approach. Does a fantastic job in dealing with its carbon impact, and is one of the best in the Lake District. So talk to Dan about that too.
Amazing. I think I'm going to come and visit up actually soon, Dan. So I'll let you know, and we can arrange a chat there. Gav, I don't know if you or Claire want to address a bit of this as well. I know that on the course that you're creating, Gav, obviously addressing decarbonisation is quite key, but it's interesting that interconnectivity that you've explored. I know on the plastic side you had some great perspectives on how to frame the single-use plastics debate within the carbon and climate debate, and I think that's really interesting interplay.
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Richard said there, actually, that it does sort of, by looking at the carbon impact, it does sort of include all of the bits and pieces that are involved in your supply line naturally within that process. My one sort of thing that I'd like to see maybe organisations and people paying more attention to is the carbon that is included in the creation of stuff. So it's you know, it's quite easy to say my ski shop, or I'm net zero because I swapped to a green energy supplier. I don't have a vehicle. Like, that's easy. I'm net zero. It's done. But obviously, the largest amount of the CO2 that's involved in my business is from the supply line and the products that are manufactured on the other side of the world. And so I think it's key that we don't just sort of say, oh yeah, I've got rid of the carbon within my business, but that we actually start to look at every little piece that's coming into our business. And I don't know whether they do that in a national park, if they're looking into the products that are entering the national park, for example. That's a question for Richard.
Yes, the budget is consumption based. I think to do it without that is cheating.
Yeah. Good. Great to hear.
I guess, Claire, I don't know if you want to add a little bit on this perspective as well, given the fact that you guys look at this quite holistically too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think given that there's elements that are outside of our control, in terms of how our clients travel to resort and what they do when they're here and that sort of thing, I think there's definitely a lot of elements to it. But yeah, to echo what Jeremy and Gav and Richard actually have all said, I do think the overarching, you know, certainly in a service-based environment, unlike Gavin, obviously we don't deal with that many products as such. It's definitely, you know, a lot of our operation, but I think the diversity of the types of businesses that are operating in tourism means that, yeah, every little element needs to be looked at, really. And whether that's carbon emissions, or whether that's carbon in products, or whether that's you know, anything else really, biodiversity in local environments.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for sharing your perspectives on that question. I think it's interesting to hear all of your inputs on that from slightly different angles. I think from all of your regions, and I think everyone's got a different take on that. And finance is quite interesting. There's big debate going on around some of the issues in terms of the scopes of those emissions. So yeah, anyone that's interested in that, please do get in touch, because it would be great to continue that debate. There's two interesting links that have been shared in the chat, and I encourage everybody to save those or have a look at those. One is from Fabrice Soren, and he's an amazing researcher in terms of circular economy and tourism. He's also part of the LinkedIn group, so anyone that wants to connect with him, please do. And Danny Boyston as well, who works with PAL France and also is doing a lot of research on sustainable tourism, has shared an interesting link about calls for projects based in French regions in terms of sustainability and transition. So again, encourage you all to have a little look at that, and do connect with those guys as well on the LinkedIn group. So now we're going to move to breakout sessions for around 20 minutes or so. And these are going to be facilitated by Jim MacNeil. So I'm going to hand the floor to Jim and then to Dan to introduce themselves a little bit too. So Jim, I guess what could be interesting for people to hear is where you see some of the levers as well. I know you do a lot of work on community action on sustainability, and we had an interesting debate recently around the role of social capital in terms of trust and in terms of getting quite localized action around climate change, and how social capital can play a role in influencing some of the people that might be slightly resistant to engage on transition in an area. So Jim, I'm going to hand over to you, and then I'll get Dan to introduce himself. Then we'll move to the breakout rooms. In terms of the topics for those breakout rooms, we're going to be focusing on some of the challenges around transition that we all feel in the room. And also, secondly, moving into how you can get much greater stakeholder buy-in in terms of community engagement and what that looks like in the regions that we're all operating in. Because I know we have a couple of people from the Himalayas on the line, quite a few people from the European Alps, some from the UK, so hopefully a nice diversity of perspectives there. Jim, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, hey everyone, I'm Jim, and I'm a researcher at the University of Valdosta, so currently focused in more economics and tourism, but my PhD was in community development, because I'm trying to combine these two approaches, and recently I've been working with Gavin, and to really, because I really think it's important to kind of really advance this approach to more circular business models. And I really like his approach in really involving all these different actors and trying to get like a common vision is very important in this discussion for transitioning to these more sustainable business models. So like I said, and I've actually working on redesigning a course at my university in nonprofits and corporate social responsibility, and I've actually, and Gavin will be one of the guest lecturers or guest speakers in the course. So I think, yeah, like I said, once again, really getting this word out there on what they're doing, and this more collaborative approach is essential for the future. So
amazing, thank you so much. Dan, I'm going to hand over to you as well. I know Dan's been absolute rock on this project over the last 3 years and really supported on lots of different fronts, especially on brainstorming around where we go on this dialogue and giving me a really local perspective, partly because I'm stuck in London for the last year and a half. So yeah, Dan, it'd be great to hear your perspective on some of what's been said as well.
Yeah, hi, my name's Dan. I was a ski instructor for many years, but worked in the tourism industry. I'm now an event manager, and also worked for hotels and in the gastronomy. So I guess you'd say I have more of a ground roots knowledge of much of what goes on, as opposed to a policy-making knowledge. But yeah, I feel the conversation for me always starts with that education and shifts on from there.
Amazing, thank you so much. So we're going to move into the breakout sessions now. So what will happen is on your screen you'll see a button that says join, so you just click that, and then afterwards we'll move back into the session after around 20 minutes for a quick 5-minute debrief with our facilitators, where we'll be sharing the output and the perspectives from those particular sessions, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. So we will probably overrun by around 5 minutes or so, but essentially, hopefully you can all stay and join and hear the little debrief at the end as well. So I'm just going to bring Jim across to reflect a little bit on what was the kind of key takeaways from your session, Jim.
yeah, sure. So we mainly focus on the first question, and I guess one of the things was talking about how do you engage local. I guess we talked about the example in Courchevel where you feel like you're almost acting alone, and you don't have the support from any local policies to help push you in the right direction. And so many times you feel like there's this disconnect between the different levels, between the SMEs, the local governments, and we're talking about how do you kind of bridge these gaps. We spoke about also in Austria. Regina gave us an example that they're more, as before we were talking about France and how there's a disconnect in French, but I guess maybe more in the German, Austrian places, they have more of a collaborative approach between the government and the businesses.
Interesting.
And let's see what else we talked about. I guess one of the other things is also changing the mindset, where we're talking about how, I guess, kind of what Gavin's doing, bringing these different, bring these different places, all these different hotels, and trying to, instead of approaching things with a competitive mindset, like what can we do to share our ideas and be on the same page? And I think it's very important for the future. And some of the things we talked about, I guess, also the gap between getting not just tourists on board, but also the people who live there. And like I said, I guess the whole thing of really getting as many people as possible into this and spreading the word. And like I said, I think it's really important to involve the people who live there, and usually they've been forgotten about in the last 20, 30 years in tourism. So yeah, so that's what we talked about.
Amazing. It sounds like a really holistic discussion as well, and quite anchored in some of those like reasons why we need more empathy in the narrative. I think it's really interesting, and it can fit in our session. I'm going to hand over to Dan to reflect a little bit on the session that he was running as well, and then I'll kind of give a couple of closing remarks on our session and a bit of a look ahead to what's next.
Yeah, we started with that first question and then sort of really spent a lot of time talking around the second as well. A lot of it centered mostly on the fact that communities really are starting to work really well together. A lot of those stakeholders and their education and really pushing forward. But the biggest challenges are actually sort of attempting to force systemic change to increase that communication and stop the mixed messaging with sort of band-aid approaches to climate change, and really incorporating as many of the community leaders to force or to really get governments to start considering these policies, and not just having the policies passed down through the supply chains with costs.
That's interesting. So like the kind of waterfall effect of the policy implementation. That's really interesting. I think there's a good example of that actually in the previous study that we did in April that I encourage you all to look at with Stefan from Zelensky, and it was on that waterfall effect of how you can get a policy impetus, but then how do you get local stakeholders to actually be part of that decision-making process when you do have, for example, grants on energy transition and things that are developing there. So a lot of what you guys have said resonated quite strongly in the group that I was in as well. I think the interesting thing about communities of the willing was great from Jeremy, and I think that's all about how it's quite the first stage of a transition process is often getting on board people that are engaged on the idea of climate action. And I think in all of the communities that we all operate in, that's probably quite an important first step, is starting with the people that are part of your tribe, I guess, and part of the people that believe that climate action is necessary and vital to scale up. I think that does also come to some extent with some challenges, and particularly the fact that some of the people that might not be on that transition journey yet need a lot more engagement in terms of the levers that they need to implement. And we talked quite a lot about the psychology of the situation in terms of at a corporate level in particular, and SMEs. There's a kind of hierarchy that might exist whereby you need management to get on board with some of those decisions. You've also got potentially some issues around ego and around people not necessarily believing that it's necessary to engage so much because they have run organizations for several decades. There's a lot of kind of sclerosis on the corporate management side. There's also an interesting point about place-based strategies. I know Prue talked quite extensively about the idea of the fact that if you're looking at an approach in terms of transition strategies, it's not one size fits all. The SDGs are a useful framework, but I think they definitely have to be applied at a local level. I think the other thing that we would just kind of touch upon a little bit is why it's really important to have a bespoke approach to the way you engage quite a few of those stakeholders. I think it's quite critical to look at how actually you can use behavioral economics as part of the way to understand and empathize with people that might not agree with your perspective, and try to actually have a slightly more bespoke approach in that regard. And then finally, just a quick ending word around some of the ways that we can tap into the economic case for sustainability. I think that was clearly highlighted as something that was quite important to move ahead on, in terms of how you can engage people that don't currently engage on this at all. And I think myself, coming from the finance industry, sees that that's quite a critical part of the process ahead. So conscious of the time, and I think we're going to wrap up in a moment now, but thank you all so much for joining. Again, I would encourage you all, and I'm just going to go back on the slide now, to do join the LinkedIn group. I think that's a great way, bear with me a second, just here. So that's a great way to stay connected with everybody from the event today, and also going forward with the rest of the community as well. And thank you so much to our speakers too. I think it's been such a fascinating session. Again, so diverse in terms of the perspectives. I think whenever this finishes, I'm always quite sad to kind of go back and log off the computer and kind of, it's great to reflect, but it'd be great to continue this conversation. And I think that's why I created SATI in particular, was to get this kind of multi-stakeholder dialogue going, and it'd be great to continue to connect on that. And do encourage you all to share with our speakers as well. And any feedback as well, do drop me a line. Be great to hear from you all. This particular session will be replayed on YouTube, so that will be available online. And I'll also be sharing some highlights over the weekend on the SATI social media channels as well. So do stay connected on LinkedIn, primarily, and Twitter. And don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you'd like to speak. So follow up with any of the speakers or anyone from today as well.